The drag space swap adds something to our particle mix that most simulations will need to get anything close to realistic results. Drag simulates the natural phenomenon of entropy in the real world. This is where any object with energy will tend to lose that energy over time by losing its energy by its conversion to sound, or heat, or light, or whatever, via friction. We are only really concerned in particles with friction as the main energy loss, and that friction can be with a surface via a collision test and space warp, or with a gas or fluid via a drag space warp. So, how does it work? Well, this force will have an energy damping effect on your particles. It has no effect on their rotational spin, however, and its default mode of linear damping, it will actually remove energy in any of the three axes, and by default is set to only remove 5% of the energy in the x-axis. For general use, you'll also want to make the other two axes also use the same setting, as generally, obviously, you want particles to lose energy no matter which direction they travel in. For this particular force, I will not go through all of the options and the myriad of parameters in each, as generally the first option, linear damping, will give you a good enough idea of how it works. So let's have a look at the general parameters and those options in it now. Here you can see we have our particle flow, and we have particles being sent outwards. Now, I'll just turn this off here so we can get a better idea of how it works without the drag force in there. And you can see we've got it here as well. So let's actually just press play. And you can see our particles get blown outwards by initial speed value, and they just keep on going. And going and going and going and going. They're never actually going to slow down. Now, in space this might be a good thing, but if it was in a planetary atmosphere, or if it was underwater even, then you'd expect there to be some drag. Obviously underwater you'd have even more drag. So let's actually stop that and go back to the beginning and turn on our drag forces. Now if I press play, you'll see that the particles explode outwards initially, and then they come to a very quick decrease in speed. Now if I go into the drag force, you can actually see why that's actually happening. We'll quickly run through the parameters here. With the drag force, you actually have the option of having the force come on at a certain time and go off at a certain time. That's useful obviously when you want drag just to have an effect in a certain time period, but obviously that can be counterintuitive when you have, let's say, a 700 frame simulation and you create your drag force, and it obviously has these values by default, the 0 to 200 value. For that you'll obviously want to change it to 0 to 700 or whatever. A way around of this constantly having to change this drag is to actually create a script which actually creates your drag space warp for you and actually sets up these values to be correct. I find with the default values that actually the drag space warp isn't exactly the way I would want it most of the time. Most of the time I would want the time on and time off values to be equal to the time range that I have, maybe with, let's say, 100 frames on it afterwards just for good measure. I would normally want unlimited range turned on, which you can see here, and I would want linear damping to be x-axis 5, y-axis 5, and z-axis 5, just as good starting values. By default, the actual linear damping values are set as x-axis 5, y0, and z0, and as I've just said, that isn't really very useful. So probably a good idea to create a little button to make your drag space swaps for you if you're actually working on particles all of the time. Now it's these values here that are actually causing our particles to slow down, whichever direction they travel in. If I actually go back to the beginning and change these to much higher values, let's say 20, 20, 20, and press play, you'll see that our particles lose their energy very, very, very quickly. So that might be more like a bullet actually firing into water, let's say, rather than a bullet firing through air. Obviously you're going to have very low values in air. So there we go. If we press play again, you'll see now I'm using a much lower value, so our particles are actually allowed to fly out much further before they actually lose their energy. So that's basically it really for the drag operator, for the drag space warp. And the other options that you can use are, you can turn off unlimited range, and then you can use these range values here. And when the unlimited range tick box is not checked, this value defines the range within which the x-axis damping force is applied to its maximum effect, which you can actually see here. You've got this range value here. The fall-off value, this value actually defines the second range to which the damping force will fall off to 0. The range is measured from the center of the icon out to the range value in a sphere, but its drop-off only starts at the edge of the sphere defined by the range value. As you can see, these three values are then repeated for the y-axis and the z-axis. In general, you will use all three of them at the same time. You will want them to have the same value. Most fluids will be homogeneous, and therefore drag will be the same in the x-axis, the y-axis and the z-axis. So if you want them to be different, then you can obviously set different values and different ranges for each one of these options here. The drag force is something that you'll want to use in most simulations, as without it, particles given speed will retain that speed forever and continue flying onwards in a very linear manner. The drag force is something that you will want to use in most simulations, as without it, particles are given speed and will retain that speed forever and continue flying onwards in a very linear manner. If you want to simulate anything flying through air or through water, as I've just said earlier, you will need a drag force in your flow. If, for instance, you had bullets firing through the air and then hitting water, you would want a drag with maybe, say, 2% in the air, and then after hitting the water, you would probably want to use a much higher drag value of maybe 30% or more. One last thing to bear in mind with drag is that it will have very little effect on slowing down particles that are being moved by a wind's force turbulence, as I mentioned in the previous chapter. You can see this in our example file by turning on the wind force. So we'll actually do that now. There we go, and I'll actually turn on unlimited range and put these back up to quite high values actually. Let's go for 20, 20 and 20. And we'll just press play on that. Now, as you can see, even though we have a drag set to 20, 20 and 20, the original force which was applied by our speed, that's actually been pretty much cancelled out almost immediately by the drag force. But as you can see, the actual turbulence force is being applied on every single integration step. And because of that, our particles are being constantly pushed along by the turbulence. And as you can see, the drag is having actually no effect on that whatsoever. That's just a limitation of the drag space swap as it is at the moment in Max. Hopefully, at some point in the future, either Orbaz Technologies or Discrete themselves will rewrite the drag space swap to actually take into account the turbulence that we have in the wind operator, or indeed with any of their own operators. But as you can see, for now, this is something that we have to be aware of. Drag will not actually slow down the turbulence effect of the wind space warp. Before moving on, I'll give a quick description of what these other options do. As you can see here, linear damping means that we have a damping take place in all three axes at the same time. Spherical damping will actually base the drag on a spherical gizmo, and in this case, again, the position of the actual drag has a major effect. When you use linear damping and you have unlimited range turned on, the icon can actually be anywhere for the drag. When you have unlimited range turned off, then the actual position of the drag icon actually has an effect on, obviously, the fall off within the scene. With spherical damping, the damping is obviously based on a spherical gizmo, and with cylindrical damping you get the same thing again, but obviously it's based on a cylindrical gizmo. So that means more drag is applied on the particles as they head outwards from the axis than they are when they head upwards. You can actually see this in this example here. If I press play, you can see the particles explode outwards, and you can see they stopped moving away from the axis very quickly. Actually, let me just do that again and just turn off this wind here. They explode out from the axis very quickly, and you can see they actually slow down heading away from the axis. But you'll notice that when some of the particles deviate and they're moving upwards and downwards, that the drag doesn't have much an effect of them in those directions. So that is what the cylindrical damping does, and as I said, spherical does a very similar thing. The best thing to do is actually to try out both of those options and see what they do. And as you can see, you have a number of parameters on each one of them to control how the spherical damping and the cylindrical damping is applied. Okay, that's it for the drag space warp. Let's move on now to the vortex space warp and see what happens there.